For a look at how today might have been impacted by the past, I want to bring in our presidential historians, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Doug Brinkley, and John Meacham, who has a new book coming out tomorrow, titled American Struggle, Democracy, Dissent, and the Pursuit of a More Perfect Union, an Anthology. We were joking during the break with Eugene Daniels before he left that this is sort of like presidential historian Avengers. And so I'm very happy to have all of you here with me. And on my show, I was talking to Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and spending time on the idea that on this President's Day, we remember presidents, yes, for their actions, but also really for the characteristics and the moral fortitude that they brought to this most difficult job. And so with that in mind, Doris, I'll go to you first. Who are you keeping front of mind today of our many presidents, and why?
Well, I think Teddy Roosevelt said it best in a way. He said the greatest thing a president can do is the display of his character, setting an example, and upholding the standards. And really, just think about what that means. That means the qualities that you want in your kids, the qualities you want in your leaders at all levels of humility and empathy and resilience and accountability and kindness and compassion and an ambition for something larger than themselves. So when I think of who are my guys, they happen to be the ones I've lived with all this time. I picked them in part because I knew they had those qualities. So starting with Lincoln, the idea that he had the humility when he first came into office to surround himself with people who are more powerful than him, each one who thought he should be president instead of him. And he said, the country's in peril. This is the people I need by my side. Some people said, you'll be a figurehead if you do it. And he said, no, this is what I need to do. But, of course, Lyndon Johnson said in less noble language, it's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And then at the end of his life, he shows that empathy toward the South and the idea of bringing the country back together again. No retribution, no hanging, no prosecutions, no more hate. I just want to move forward. So, yeah, I think of him, and then I think of Theodore Roosevelt, who made himself the president of all the people. And then you think of FDR, that optimism that he brought to that first inaugural. He changed the mood of the country overnight. People said, we feel better, we have a leader, we have a government. So those are the qualities I think you look for. And if we look at those qualities today, it's even more important than what they did.
Yeah, I think it really underscores also the way that we're seeing our current president, Doug, sort of tear at some of the fabrics of these moments that Doris is talking about. The idea that these are presidents that we look back on who used our higher calling in this country to try to get us over the most difficult moments of tumult that we've seen within it. And so to that end, we heard some of the names that Doris brought up there. But I wonder the way that you're thinking about figures that you've written about, like Teddy Roosevelt and others, on this President's Day.
Well, I agree with Doris completely. I mean, certainly no matter how you look at it, Abraham Lincoln had it worse than any other president, and Abraham Lincoln is the #1 ranked president in the country. He gave us, in addition to some of the things Doris said, all these foundational documents. I mean, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation, the first inaugural, the second inaugural held in the middle of the Civil War. And when Lincoln died and his casket moved, from Washington, New York, back to Springfield, Illinois to be buried, it was the time when everybody was dropping their weapons in the Civil War, Confederates and Union alike. It was a homecoming. And Lincoln, our prairie president, I see there's really just nothing like him in American history. But George Washington is usually ranked #2, and for a good reason, being the first, setting precedents, as George W. Bush said in a little bit of an earlier clip, and basically having to invent what the modern cabinet is like, invent the job of being a president. But in more modern times, I'm always inspired by John F. Kennedy. I know scholars put him lower than I do. But, I think going to the moonshot, the idea that Americans, we can do something, the last big gasp of can-doism. And I look out of Kennedy's moonshot, Apollo vision, all the spin-off technology we got, like, GPS, MRI, CAT scan, all of these things started coming out of NASA because Kennedy chose NASA as an incubator for the technological revolution we're in right now. In my field I love the most, conservation, taking care of the public lands and waters. Theodore Roosevelt's the kingpin. He saved 234 million acres of wild America, places like Muir Woods and the Grand Canyon and Devil's Tower. He's extraordinary. And Jimmy Carter, who recently died, only one term. But whenever we look at the Middle East and see the trauma going on there, I think back to the diplomacy of Carter to get Begin and Sadat together at Camp David and develop that lasting peace between Egypt and Israel.
Yeah, just such a massive moment with major ripple effects on the geopolitical stage. And so, John Meacham, I turn to you now. And as I listen to some of your colleagues and friends reflecting on this President's Day, it makes me think, as someone who has covered multiple presidential campaigns myself, of the ways that we look at these presidents on President's Day who have high moral fortitude, really. And yet presidential campaigns are politics and brawling and policy. There's very little test of character in that. And so I wonder how you square those two circles. The greatest presidents are the ones with the most optimistic view for the future and the most moral fortitude and character.
That's the source of hope, it seems to me. And I do want to reassure people that when Doris says she's lived with a bunch of guys, it's a metaphorical thing, because I know that people will get upset about this. And she was, and we miss Dick. But he was not jealous of Lincoln and TR that I know of. So that important point to the side. That's what should give us some hope, right? Is that we don't elect statues. We don't elect remote icons. We elect human beings. And the people that Doug and Doris have mentioned are remarkable. But they were not entirely remarkable all the time. They got a lot wrong through the years. And the great thing about our greatest presidents, it seems to me, is that they got big things right. Abraham Lincoln was not an egalitarian until the very, very end. I'm sitting here with Reverend Sharpton. They know he was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist, right? So it's always a little more complicated than a holiday can capture. But I think that's a source of hope, not despair, of energy, not cynicism. It's that, in fact, human beings can rise to occasions, which is why, Allie, your first question is so important. It's why character matters. You don't know, you never know what's going to hit you when you go into that office. That's the one sure thing, is that it is uncertain. And so what matters, the thing I always want to know about a potential president, is how have they responded to a crisis in the past, usually a personal one. TR had lost his young wife. An extraordinary number, an unusual number of American presidents actually lost children. Dwight Eisenhower, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan. And how do they recover and go forward from these emotional moments can tell you an enormous amount about how they're going to help shape all of our lives.
John, in that context, isn't it also a lot about how they measure up to the pronounced a dream of what America was to be? Because, like, for example, we're getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but many people in the country were not part of the country. Blacks had been enslaved since 1619. That was not their declaration. Women later had to take a long time to vote. So wouldn't you measure many of these presidents based on also how they had to preside over a different country? When you look at Lyndon Johnson was a favorite of mine because how he dealt with the civil rights movement that literally changed things, or Barack Obama that embodied it. But a lot of presidents were president of a different, smaller country in terms of what was available to people's rights and people's lifestyles.
Right. And what you always have to do, and Douglas and Doris do this as well all day long, is when you render moral judgments about the past, which is always a tricky thing to do. Right. Arthur Schlesinger used to say, self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. But you can judge it by assessing the anti-prevailing voices of the era, right? So you can judge Lincoln based on the fact that Frederick Douglass was making a certain case. You can judge FDR on the internment of Japanese Americans of Japanese descent, because there were people arguing against it. I believe that every American president, every American generation can be judged and should be judged on the degree to which we live into or fall away from the fulfillment of that central promise that Thomas Jefferson, also I think an underrated president, wrote in June of 1776. As Lincoln said, by the way, no one ever had a better friend than Thomas Jefferson had the best friend in the world. Doris, you would agree on this, I think, in Abraham Lincoln. Because in Gettysburg, he lifts the Declaration. Right, the Civil War was kind of about, the Constitution. It was, can you secede? The Confederates wanted it to be a legal constitutional argument. Lincoln said, no, the proposition is eternal. It's not about mechanics. Right. And
if
American
I could just
presidents
follow you, John, in a way.
Yeah.
I was just thinking
about. If I could just follow you, I think it's important for us to realize that each one of them came into office, they were really worried about whether they had the capacity to do what they wanted to do. When Washington was on his way to his inauguration, he said he felt like he was going to his execution, that he was just worried that would he keep the voice of the country, would he keep his own reputation alive? And he said, firmness and integrity is all that I can promise. When FDR was about to give his inauguration, somebody said, if your program works, you'll be one of the great presidents. If it fails, you'll be one of the worst. And no, he said ominously, I'll be the last American president. When TR came in, the country was in tumult. There was anarchist bombings in the streets. He followed an assassination. The classes were divided. He said that if people began seeing each other as they were then, the other, then there would be no common American citizen. And that was his job. So he somehow creates the square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalists and labor. And he's finally getting a library, as Doug Brinkley and I know, we're both on the board, so that I think they each come in. We have to see they're human beings. There's enormous pressure. And how do they, through resilience, through adversity, as was said by John and Doug, come through? And I think it's a great day that we're celebrating. I'm so happy to be here on President's Day. It's been 60 years of my life that I've been studying these guys. So I feel like I've lived with them longer than anybody other than my late husband.
Yeah, and I think that's right, because for all of you who study these men, it is like you're living with them, because you are going through the deepest and most rich parts of their presidency, but also their life, to understand the personal experiences that shape them for some of these pinnacle high-stake moments that ultimately make or break their presidencies. And I wonder, Doug, as we continue reflecting on this President's Day, the way that you, as an historian who has written through all of these various stories of presidents, then look at and almost contrast the ways that this present White House has attempted to put their own stamp on presidential history by putting these plaques filled with, partisan rhetoric and misinformation up at the White House, and the ways that colors the view of this President's Day, or not at all. Your reflections, your thoughts.
Well, I think the plaques that President Trump put up in the White House does gobbledygook. Most of them are nonsensical. There are a lot of exclamation points in them. There's a lot of saying, for example, Ronald Reagan, who he loved Trump, before most people loved Trump. And that's in like the little bio plaque of Ronald Reagan. He attacks George W. Bush for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He claims that Jimmy Carter sold Panama Canal for $1. So it's not really history of and then, of course, the auto pen portrait of Joe Biden. It's not history coming out of the Trump White House. It's hyper Donald Trump, rah-rah spin. But that will be part of presidential history. We'll be looking back decades from now how Donald Trump used different presidents. I think any president who was for a tariff, he puts things in capital T.
Yes.
Grover Cleveland was the tariff president, and William McKinley loved tariffs and liked Donald J. Trump. And he formulates things like that. And I think somehow, as they say, Barack Obama lives rent-free in the president's head. Barack Obama's been out there the last few days talking about America, talking about history. He's opening his presidential library in Chicago Presidential Center, and soon to be opening all of his oral histories with Columbia University. And we really haven't been able to catch up with Obama studies yet in a full way. But 8 years, two-term, first Black American as president, it's going to be looked at once we get more national security documents and things released from Freedom of Information Act. But Obama's looking pretty good in the annals of history because he ran, by and large, a clean and honest and fair administration.
Doris, when we talk about the complexities of character in broadly put, our lifetimes, President Johnson is, in fact, I think probably stands out prior to the 45th and 47th president. So we'll just jump back there. But you knew him well and lived at the ranch, worked on the memoir. When you think about the complexity of Lyndon Johnson, what does that tell you about the country? What does that tell us about? What does that tell us about the rest of us?
Yeah, it's such an important question because obviously that scar of how he handled the war in Vietnam will always be living with him. But on the other hand, his courage and his bravery and his vision about what to do with domestic politics from the moment he became president. He made that first speech to a joint session of Congress, taking the risk to say that nothing is more important for the memorial of John Kennedy than the passage of that civil rights bill that he had introduced that June. People told him, you can't do that. You'll never get it through the filibuster. You'll be a failed president. And he famously said, then what the hell is the presidency for? And then he went for Medicare and Medicaid and aid to education and NPR and PBS and immigration reform and voting rights. And he really put himself on the line to make this country a better place with the Great Society. I mean, I'm so proud that my husband was there by his side during that he was swimming in a pool with him when they came up with the whole idea of calling this the Great Society. He wanted a program of his own. But I'll always be grateful for him. It's where I really wanted to become a presidential historian, despite having written an article against him, which the New Republic titled when they put it out 2 days after the big dance in the White House celebrating my White House fellowship. How to remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Instead of kicking me out of the program, he said, come down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So he was an extraordinary person. You're right, he was a complex person. The strengths that he had domestically were not the same way the strengths he did not have in foreign policy. But he's going to be remembered for a man who really put his whole policy on the line, wanted the South to come back into the Union, and did more for civil rights, I think, than anyone other than Abraham Lincoln. Yay for him on this day.
And this, for me, I have to say, will be remembered as one of the more fun panels that I ever got to be a part of. Doris Kearns Goodwin and Doug Brinkley, thank you both for coming on, bringing history to life for us on this President's Day. John Meacham, we're not